Hey everyone, it's Wolfgang. I'm going to explain why the Federal Reserve was late to tackle inflation in 2022 and why the Federal Reserve is late now to tackle the problems in the job market. So in August of 2020, 5 years ago almost, Jerome Powell was the Fed chairman at that time. He changed, the entire Federal Reserve changed how they interpret data. This is the reason that the Fed is late all the time. And I'm going to explain why and how it works. They made a decision back in August of 2020 on how they interpret data, inflation data and economic data. That is what's been causing all the problems. Okay, so if you remember, back in June of 2022, the Federal Reserve allowed inflation to reach 9.1%, almost 9.2%, back in June of 2022. That was the highest inflation in 41 years, okay? So I want to point something out. They made a change in August of 2020 on how they interpret economic data. 2 years later, we're blowing out inflation numbers, a 41-year high. They should have realized back then that this was a mistake. The change they made interpreting data was the wrong decision. They did not make any change, though. They persisted. So the highest inflation in 41 years was reached back in June of 2022. 9.1% inflation. We all remember what that was like. It has not been since 1981 that inflation in the United States got that high. A long time ago. 1981 to 2022, 41-year high. So how did that happen? And if you think about it, if you were in their position, wouldn't you say to yourself, okay, we made this change in August 2020 and all of a sudden we're hitting 41-year highs in inflation. Was that a mistake? Wouldn't you self-correct? Yes, you would. If you're a rational person, you would have corrected how you're interpreting data. You would have taken another look at this and decided we're going to have to make another change because this has led us down the wrong path. Right now, the inflation is about 2.1% in the U.S., very close to the target. Today, the Federal Reserve did not lower interest rates, even though the job market is showing signs of problems. And there are other economic problems, too. The real estate market, for example, is basically dead. The real estate market, right now, there are 500,000 more homes for sale than there are buyers in the U.S. The reason, it's not because people don't want to buy homes. It's because they cannot qualify for a mortgage for those homes because interest rates are too high. So August 2020, they changed how they interpret the data. 2 years later, almost 2 years later, we're hitting 41-year highs in inflation, and they did not correct that decision. They doubled down and stuck with the way they interpret data, which is why we're here today, why they're keeping interest rates too high. Okay, so here's what the Fed did back when inflation reached the 41-year high. Here's how they reacted to it. I want to point something out before I describe this data. They waited until bad things were happening in the economy to take action. That's a bad thing in the economy. Almost 10% inflation, that's horrible. They waited until June of 2022, and I'm going to show you they should have acted sooner, to make any changes. Here are the changes they started making. They increased interest rates a month later in July of 2022 by almost 1%, by 0.75%, 75, they call that 75 basis points. 1 month after we reached 41-year high inflation. In September, another 75 basis points increase in interest rates. Another 75 basis point increase in November. So 0.75, 0.75, 0.75 really quickly. So they understood that we're in trouble here, right? But I'm going to show you in a couple seconds here, a couple minutes, that they should have anticipated that this was going to happen and taken action long before this, long before July of 2022. In December of 2022, they increased interest rates again for the fourth time, 0.5%, 50 basis points. And then there were several 0.25% interest rate increases in quick succession, February, March, May, and July of 2023. So if you start here, July of 2022, and you add all these up, they increased interest rates dramatically in a very short period of time. Again, a 41-year high in inflation in the U.S. They had to do something. But the point is they waited until the current data was very bad to take any action. I'm going to show you in a couple seconds here that they should have seen this coming and taken action before July of 2022. So they were caught, the Fed was caught with their pants down. They should never have let inflation get to 9.1%. Okay, so what change did they make with the data. In August of 2020, FAIT, flexible average inflation targeting, was a new way that they began looking at data, backward looking at the data. This FAIT purposely allows inflation to overshoot the 2% target. The Fed usually wants 2% annual inflation in the U.S. economy. But this change they made in August of 2020 purposely allows inflation to exceed the 2% target they have. So 9.1% is so far above 2%, it's not even funny. So you can see the magnitude of the error that they made. They adopted FAIT August of 2020. It purposely allows overshooting the 2% target rate the Fed prefers, but they shouldn't have allowed it to get this high, okay? So let me explain where inflation was before this happened, before this huge spike in inflation occurred. In 2016 through 2020, inflation was about 2.5%. That's higher than we have now. That's higher inflation than we have now, okay? 2.5% for those years, 2016 through 2020. In 2021, in April of 2021, inflation reached 4.2%. In April of 2021, inflation reached 4.2%. That's more than twice what their target is. They should have started taking these actions in April of 2021. They waited until July 2022, 14 months after inflation hit 4.2%. They waited 14 months to act on inflation that they knew was happening. If you look at the numbers, inflation was, let's see here, it was in March, it was already at 2.6%. Inflation was at 2.6%. So it was 2.5% through 2020. March of 2021, it hit 2.6%. The next month, 4.2%. Eventually in 2021, it hit 7%. They waited over a year to take any action. Okay? So this is how Jerome Powell, gained the nickname Late Jerome Powell. You know, they made a mistake here. This change they made in August 2020, this was wrong. This was a mistake, okay? Because by looking only at the rearward data, 2.5% for 4 years, if that's all they were considering, they waited until the last minute plus 14 months to act on inflation in the U.S. economy. So this was a mistake. FAIT, they're going to have to change this or drop it. They're going to have to consider real-time current data instead of backward looking at the data, at the economic data. April of 2021, 4.2%. Later that year, I believe December of 2021, 7% inflation. And yet they waited until July of 2022 to start raising interest rates. So the Fed raises interest rates to reduce inflation. When the Fed raises interest rates, it makes borrowing more expensive. Borrowing for a car or a home, using credit cards becomes more expensive. So people stop spending as much, and that reduces inflation. So this is why we got to this point, and that's why the Fed is not lowering interest rates now, because they're still looking at inflation in the recent past. And inflation in the recent past was 9.1% not so long ago. So we dug into how the Fed could consistently be late to adjust interest rates. And this is the reason. FAIT, flexible average inflation targeting, Jerome Powell allowed that to be adopted in August of 2020. That is why we are where we are. That's why they did not lower interest rates today. That's why the housing market is dead. The housing market is dead in the U.S. There are 500,000 more homes for sale than there are buyers because people cannot qualify for mortgage loans. It's not because people don't want to buy a home. They can't qualify for the mortgage because interest rates are too high. And this is the reason. Powell allowed the Federal Reserve to adopt this change, and they're sticking to it, even though they knew as early as 2 years after the change that they had made a mistake. They did not correct the mistake. 3 years later, in 2025, June, we are still stuck with this mistake, and that is why we are where we are. And it's pretty tragic because the housing market creates a lot of jobs. If those 500,000 homes that are for sale in the U.S., more than there are buyers, if the housing market picked up, it would help remodeling companies, landscaping, because whenever people sell their old home and buy a new home, they end up spending a lot of money on things besides the house: landscaping, remodeling, flooring, lighting, furniture, appliances. all the things that are associated with purchasing a home and selling the old home are not happening in the economy, and interest rates are so high, we have too many people who cannot qualify for a mortgage. So they're going to have to change this. So the next Fed chair is going to have to commit to scrapping this, to getting rid of this. It's not working. They knew 2 years after that change, it was a mistake, right? And they didn't change it. They kept it. They kept this failure, FAIT. So they're going to have to change that. The next Fed chair probably will not get the job unless they agree to get rid of this change that obviously doesn't work. Because right now they should have lowered interest rates already. So many people in this economy have said they should have lowered rates already. If you watch one of my earlier videos, I explain why the type of inflation that Jerome Powell is saying he wants to use interest rates to fight, it really doesn't work. There's two kinds of inflation. There's demand pull inflation, cost push inflation. So adjusting interest rates has no effect or very little effect on cost push inflation. And yet Powell is making the argument that he's keeping interest rates high to tackle cost push inflation. So he's incompetent. I'm sorry to say that. But the captain of the ship has the responsibility for steering the ship. Ultimately, he makes the final call. So Powell has to he needs to take responsibility for this incompetency. 3 years after this mistake, and they still haven't changed this, is a problem. And the U.S. housing market has been suffering for a long time. It's basically dead. There's so many more homes for sale than there are buyers. It's tragic. And so now you know how we got to where we are. They made a change in how they interpret data in August of 2020. It only uses backward-looking data unless there's a disaster. There's some stuff I couldn't fit on the board. Right now, the Fed only considers present data. The change they made had them looking backward. They only consider present data when something bad happens. So what's going to happen in the near future? They're going to keep rates high, keep rates high, keep rates high. The housing market, not only the housing market will keep suffering, but the job market is going to continue to deteriorate. The only saving grace for the job market is the mass migration is being reversed. So a lot of jobs are opening up that will end up hiring U.S. citizens. So that's one thing that's good for the job market. But what they really need to do is drop this, get rid of FAIT, and go back to interpreting data the way they did previously. Allowing inflation to reach a 41-year high 2 years after they made the change, they knew something was wrong and they did nothing to fix it. That's the problem. And that's why we are where we are now. So if you have any questions about this or comments, I'd be happy to answer any questions you have. And I really want to thank everyone for watching, and have a great day.